August 14th, 1945. The high plains, southeastern Colorado. The wind didn't just blow, it scoured. It carried the taste of ancient silica and the metallic tang of a distant thunderstorm. Hanako, 28, stood knee-deep in a field of sorghum, the stalks green and impossibly tall against the brown horizon. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down at 98 degrees, but she didn't wipe the sweat stinging her eyes. She was staring at the ground. At her feet, the soil was moist, dark, alive. To her left, beyond the barbed wire perimeter of Camp Amache, the neighboring unmanaged fields were gray and cracked, the topsoil stripped away by the relentless black rollers. But here, inside the prison, the earth held. She ran her hand along the stalk of sorghum. It wasn't planted in a straight line, the mark of discipline she had been raised to revere. It curved, a serpentine, chaotic arc that hugged the belly of the hill. It held, Hanako-san, a voice whispered behind her. It was Mrs. Sato, clutching a bushel basket. The water stayed. Hanako looked at the strange geometry of the field. The curves looked like a river frozen in dirt. She looked at the guard tower in the distance, then back at the flourishing crop. The dissonance made her dizzy. The enemy's science had saved their food. Yes, Hanako said, her voice cracking. It held. 4 months earlier, the planting season, April 12th, 1945. The dust in Colorado was different from the dust in Kyoto. In Japan, the earth had a smell. Loam, history, decay. Here, the dirt tasted like ground glass. It settled in the creases of Hanako's eyelids and coated her tongue with a metallic dryness that water couldn't wash away. Hanako Tanaka adjusted her headscarf, tying the knot tight beneath her chin. She stood before the 20 women of the Block 9 agricultural crew. They were a mix of Issei grandmothers with bent backs and Nisei girls who chewed gum when the guards weren't looking. Behind them, the red Farmall H tractor sat idling, its engine a rude, coughing rhythm in the morning heat. Straight lines, Hanako said in Japanese, her voice cutting through the wind. We plant as we have always planted, efficient, orderly. The rows must look like the strings of a koto. It was a matter of pride. Here, behind the 5-strand barbed wire of the Amache Relocation Center, the only thing they controlled was the dirt. If they planted crooked rows, they admitted defeat. They admitted they were broken. A cloud of dust approached from the administration sector. A Ford pickup truck, painted the drab olive of the War Department, bounced over the ruts and skidded to a halt near the tractor. Dale Miller stepped out. He was a tall man with a sunburned neck and a fedora that had seen better days. He wore the badge of the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, not the Army, but to Hanako, the difference was negligible. He carried a roll of blue paper and a wooden tripod. Hanako stiffened. She signaled the women to keep their eyes down. "Morning, Miss Tanaka," Miller said. He didn't bow. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "We need to talk about this field. The gradient here is about 4%. "We are ready to plow, Mr. Miller," Hanako said, her English crisp, accented with the cadence of the University of Tokyo. "North to south, as discussed." "No," Miller said. He unrolled the blue paper on the hood of his truck. It was a map covered in swirling organic lines that looked like fingerprints. Not north to south, not straight. If you plow straight on this slope, the next rain will wash your seeds right into the Arkansas River. We're doing contour farming. Hanako looked at the map. It was chaos. Winding, nonsensical squiggles. Contour, she repeated, the word tasting sour. "You want us to drive the tractor in circles?" "Not circles, curves. We follow the elevation." Miller tapped the map. "It catches the water, keeps the soil in place. It's the only way to farm the high plains." "In Japan," Hanako said coldly, "straight rows are a sign of discipline. Curved rows are for drunkards." Miller looked at her. He didn't get angry. He just looked tired. He reached into the truck bed and pulled out a heavy brass instrument case. "This isn't Japan, Miss Tanaka. This is the Dust Bowl. The wind doesn't care about your discipline. It cares about physics." He set the case down in the dirt between them. "I'm leaving the sighting level and the stakes. If those rows are straight by tomorrow, I'll have the WRA shut down your vegetable garden program. You'll be back to eating canned spinach in the mess hall." He got back in the truck and slammed the door. As he drove away, the dust billowed up, coating Hanako's pristine work shirt. She looked down at the brass case. It looked like a weapon. The brass instrument felt heavy and cold in Hanako's hands, like an unexploded shell. It was a dumpy level, a standard tool of the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, sitting heavily on its wooden tripod legs. "It makes no sense," muttered Mrs. Sato, holding a bundle of white wooden laths, survey stakes, tight against her chest to keep the wind from snatching them. "The ground is flat, Hanako-san. Look at it, flat as a tatami mat." Hanako looked. Mrs. Sato was right. To the naked eye, the field stretched out in a dull brown plain toward the distant barracks of Block 11. There was no hill, no valley, just the relentless, deceiving emptiness of the high plains. "Miller said we must find the contour," Hanako said, her voice tight. "If we don't, we eat mush all winter." She spread the tripod legs, jamming the steel tips into the hardpan soil. The wind fought her, vibrating the legs, making the delicate glass vial on top tremble. She bent her eye to the scope. Inside the circle of glass, the world was magnified and cross-haired. She saw the magnified weave of Mrs. Sato's faded work, shirt standing 50 yards away. "Move the rod," Hanako commanded, waving her hand. "Upslope." Mrs. Sato took 5 steps. Hanako adjusted the brass leveling screws. Left thumb, right thumb, turn in, turn out. It was a precise, maddening dance to get the air bubble perfectly centered between the etched lines. It required a stillness that the camp never possessed. She looked again. Through the lens, the horizontal crosshair sliced across Mrs. Sato's knees. "Mark it!" Hanako shouted. Mrs. Sato hammered a white stake into the earth. Hanako rotated the scope, swinging it 20 degrees to the left to find the next point of equal elevation. She expected the crosshair to hit the ground. Instead, it hovered near Mrs. Sato's waist. Hanako pulled back, blinking. She looked at the field with her naked eyes. Flat. She looked through the scope. A distinct, invisible slope. A chill that had nothing to do with the wind ran down her spine. The land was lying to her. Or rather, she had not known how to look. The flatness was an illusion, masking a treacherous gradient that would accelerate water just enough to strip the soil bare. "Hanako-san?" Mrs. Sato called out, holding the hammer. Hanako stared at the bubble in the vial. It was centered, floating in its liquid prison, indifferent to her confusion. This American tool, this piece of glass and brass, saw the truth that her Japanese discipline could not. "Mark it," Hanako whispered. Then louder, "Mark it! Next point!" For 3 hours, they worked. By noon, the field was no longer an empty plain. It was stabbed with hundreds of white wooden stakes. They didn't form straight, soldierly rows. They curved. They meandered. They looked like the track of a wounded snake writhed across the earth. Hanako stood back, wiping grit from the eyepiece. It was the ugliest thing she had ever seen. It looked broken. "It is done," she said, closing the brass case with a snap. "Now we must cut it." The Farmal H roared to life, a sudden percussive violence that scattered the crows from the fence line. A cloud of blue-black diesel smoke coughed from the vertical exhaust stack, instantly snatched away by the relentless wind. Kenji, a Nisei mechanic who had owned a strawberry farm in Florin before the war, sat in the steel bucket seat. He looked down at the field of white stakes, then back at Hanako. He spat on the ground. "You're joking," Kenji shouted over the engine's clatter. "You want me to drive like I'm drunk? The boys in Block 6 are going to laugh us out of the mess hall." Hanako stood near the rear tire, her arms crossed. The vibration of the idling engine rattled her teeth. She saw the faces pressed against the distant barbed wire. Old men, former farmers, watching to see how the university girl would handle the land. "Just follow the stakes, Kenji," Hanako ordered, pointing to the winding line of white wood Mrs. Sato had planted. "Keep the front wheel 6 inches to the right of the lath. Do not straighten it out." Kenji shifted the gear lever, metal ground against metal. He dropped the moldboard plow behind the tractor. The steel blades gleamed, ready to bite. "It's a sin against the soil," Kenji muttered, but he released the clutch. The tractor lurched forward. Usually, plowing was a hypnotic, meditative act. You locked the steering wheel and rode the straight furrow for half a mile, the engine humming a steady note. This was a wrestle. As the tractor hit the first curve, the plow groaned. Kenji had to fight the steering wheel, cranking it left, then correcting right, then hard left again to hug the invisible elevation line. The engine pitch whined up and down as the load on the plow changed with the turn. Hanako walked behind in the dust. The result was disturbing. Instead of the clean, military precision of parallel lines, the earth was being flayed open in a jagged, serpentine wound. The dark subsoil turned up in chaotic ribbons. It looked ugly. It looked amateurish. It looked like they had lost their minds. Hanako felt a hot flush of shame burn her neck. She could imagine Miller in his office, laughing at the Japanese trying to learn his superior American science. She was desecrating the only thing they had left to offer the world, their competence. "Hold the line," she screamed as Kenji drifted wide, trying to smooth out a sharp bend. Kenji wrestled the tricycle front end back on track, knocking over a white stake in the process. He cursed, the tractor bucking as the plow bit deep into a patch of hardpan. By sunset, the field was transformed. It was no longer a blank canvas, but a dizzying maze of dark earth swirling around the hill. Kenji killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was deafening. He climbed down, wiping grease on his trousers. He didn't look at the field. He looked at Hanako. "Well," he said, his voice flat, "we did what the white man wanted. We made a mess." Hanako looked at the furrows. They held the sorghum seeds, buried in the dark, twisted earth. "It is not a mess, Kenji," she lied, her voice hollow. "It is a tactic." May 20th, 1945. The sky did not darken. It solidified. At 2 p.m., the horizon simply erased itself. A wall of purple-black matter, thousands of feet high, rose from the south, blotting out the sun like a closing eyelid. The temperature plunged 20 degrees in 2 minutes. "Black roller!" someone screamed from the barracks. Hanako was in the field, thinning the young sorghum shoots. The air suddenly crackled. The hairs on her arms stood up, pulling painfully against her skin. A blue spark snapped from her hoe to her fingertip, shocking her. Static electricity, the herald of the dust. "Get inside!" Mrs. Sato yelled, pulling her scarf over her face. "No!" Hanako looked at the far edge of the field. There, defying Miller's orders, Hanako had kept a quarter-acre plot pure. She had ordered Kenji to plow it straight, north to south, just like in Japan. It was her secret defiance, her proof that discipline could conquer this barbaric land. She ran toward it. The wind hit her with the force of a physical blow, carrying sand that felt like buckshot. By the time she reached the straight rows, the world was a screaming void. She fell to her knees, clawing at the dirt, trying to shield the fragile green shoots with her body. It was futile. The wind didn't just blow over the straight furrows. It accelerated down them. The straight lines acted as wind tunnels. Hanako watched in horror as the topsoil, the precious dark skin of the earth, simply lifted off. It peeled away in sheets. The young plants were ripped from the ground, roots and all, and vanished into the roaring dark. In seconds, her disciplined field was nothing but hard-pan clay. Dead. "Hanako! Come on!" Kenji grabbed her arm, dragging her away. They stumbled blindly toward the equipment shed, gasping through improvised masks of wet rags. As they passed the main field, the ugly, serpentine mess Miller had forced them to create, Hanako stopped. She ripped her goggles off, squinting against the grit. The wind was howling just as hard here. But something different was happening. The curved ridges, winding perpendicular to the wind, were breaking the airflow. The wind couldn't build up speed. It tripped over every contour. The dust from the air was getting trapped in the furrows, piling up like snowdrifts around the base of the plants. The soil wasn't leaving. It was staying. The chaotic, winding, drunk lines were holding the earth in a tight embrace. The sorghum plants whipped violently, but their roots held fast, buried deep in the protected moisture of the curves. Hanako stared, transfixed, while the storm raged around her. Her straight lines, symbols of honor and order, had led to total destruction. The enemy's curves, symbols of chaos and laziness, were creating a fortress. A second blue spark jumped from the barbed wire fence nearby, snapping loudly, but Hanako didn't flinch. The shock she felt was entirely internal. The world had just inverted itself. "It works," she mouthed, the grit grinding between her teeth. "God help us, it works." Kenji pulled her into the shed and slammed the heavy door, shutting out the roar. In the sudden silence, Hanako slid down the wall to the floor, her hands shaking not from fear, but from the terrifying realization that she had been wrong. May 22nd, 1945. The silence after a dust storm was always louder than the wind itself. The world was coated in a uniform, ghostly gray powder. It muffled footsteps and made the camp look like a sepia photograph left out in the sun. Hanako stood at the edge of the field. To her right, the quarter-acre of straight rows was a graveyard, flat, hard, and barren. To her left, the contoured field was battered but alive. The furrows were filled with drifts of silt, but the green heads of the sorghum pushed through, defiant. She heard the Ford truck approach. This time, she didn't straighten her back or signal the women to look away. She just watched. Dale Miller stepped out. He walked slowly, his boots crunching on the crust. He carried a T-shaped steel tool, a soil probe. Hanako waited for the words. "I told you so, stupid Japs. Maybe next time you'll listen." She braced herself for the humiliation, the currency of her life in the camp. Miller didn't even look at the dead field. He walked straight to the contour lines. He selected a spot near the crest of a curve, positioned the steel tube, and pushed. He leaned his weight into it, driving the probe 2 feet down into the earth. He pulled it out with a wet sucking sound. "Look at this, Hanako," he said softly. He held the tube out to her. It was a peace offering. Hanako hesitated, then stepped forward. The core of soil inside the metal tube was not gray dust. The top 2 inches were dry, yes, but below that, the dirt was dark, rich, and almost black. "Moisture," Miller said, taking a pinch of the dark earth and rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. "We got 3 inches of rain before the wind hit. Your contours trapped it all. It soaked in instead of running off." He handed her the probe. The metal was cool. She could feel the dampness of the soil sample against her palm. It was the temperature of life. "If you had plowed straight," Miller said, nodding to the dead patch, "that water would be in Kansas by now." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded paper, a USDA farmer's bulletin. He didn't thrust it at her. He laid it on the tractor tire. "It's not magic, And it's not American, Miller said, looking at the horizon. It's just listening to what the ground is saying. You have a good ear, Hanako. You saved this crop, not me. He tipped his fedora, an automatic civilian gesture of respect that violated every unspoken rule of the camp guard, and walked back to his truck. Hanako stood alone with the steel probe. She looked at the dark earth in her hand. For 2 years, she had fought to keep her Japanese identity rigid, like a straight line, fearing that if she bent, she would break. She looked at the winding, chaotic rows that had survived the storm. To bend is to endure, she thought. She wiped a smudge of dust from the USDA bulletin. It was the first time since the war began that an American had spoken to her without looking at her face, but looking instead at her work. July 15th, 1945. Summer on the high plains was a hammer made of sunlight. The temperature inside the barracks hovered at 102 degrees, but out in the fields, the heat radiated upward from the soil, baking the air. The tractor is useless here, Kenji spat, wiping grease from his forehead. He kicked the tire of the farmel. I can't turn the cultivator, blades sharp enough. If I try to follow these curves, I'll chop up half the sorghum. Hanako nodded. She had expected this. The machine, built for the vast, mindless rectangles of American agriculture, was too clumsy for the intricate dance of the contours. Then we use our hands, Hanako said. She picked up a long-handled hoe. The wooden shaft was smooth, polished by the sweat of 1,000 palms. She handed it to Mrs. Sato. For the younger girls, she passed out the dreaded short-handled hoes, the ones that forced the worker to bend double, bringing their faces close to the earth. They moved into the green sea. The sorghum was waist-high now, a vibrant, shocking emerald against the tawny brown of the surrounding prairie. The weeds, spiky Russian thistle and pigweed, fought for the same moisture the contours had trapped. Chop, pull, step, chop, pull, step. The rhythm took over. For the first hour, there was only the grumbling of backs and the hiss of steel slicing through dry stalks. But as the sun climbed higher, something changed in Hanako's vision. She paused to sharpen her blade with a whetstone. From where she stood, halfway up the gentle rise, she looked down at the line of 20 women working along the terrace. They weren't moving in a grid. They were flowing. The white headscarves of the women bobbed in a perfect serpentine arc that hugged the hillside. It looked exactly like the brushstroke of a calligrapher, hiragana, written in human movement. It is like the Kamo River, a young girl named Emmy whispered, standing up to stretch her aching back. She pointed to the rows. Look, Hanako-san, the wind makes the sorghum ripple. Because the rows curve, the waves look like water flowing around a stone. Hanako lowered her whetstone. In Kyoto, the Zen monks raked the white gravel of their gardens into swirling patterns to mimic the ocean, to freeze motion in stillness. She realized with a start that Miller had accidentally recreated a Zen garden on a massive scale. The straight line was the imposition of man's will upon nature, rigid, brittle, easily broken by the storm. The curve was the acceptance of nature's will, fluid, resilient, enduring. Yes, Hanako said, her voice soft. It flows. She looked at the hoe in her hand. It was an American tool, but the motion she used, the conservation of energy, the respect for the root, was Japanese. Keep the rhythm, Hanako called out, but her tone was no longer that of a drill sergeant. It was encouraging. We are painting the hill green. For the first time since arriving at Amache, the barbed wire fence on the horizon seemed to blur. Standing deep in the curves of the grain, surrounded by the green walls of their own making, they were not prisoners. They were gardeners. September 28th, 1945. The frost was coming. You could smell it, a sharp, crisp scent of ozone that cut through the dust. The radio in the administration building had predicted a killing freeze by midnight. "Faster!" Hanako shouted, her breath pluming in the cold morning air. "Do not leave a single stalk." The field was a hive of frantic motion. 50 extra volunteers from Block 12 had joined them, men and women moving down the winding rows like locusts. But they weren't stripping the land bare. They were gathering a miracle. Hanako hefted a wire-reinforced bushel basket filled with sorghum heads. It was heavy, shockingly heavy. In previous years, the plants had been spindly, the grain heads light and rattle-dry. Today, the stalks were thick as cane, gorged on the water stored deep in the contour furrows. "Hanako-san," Mrs. Sato called out from the loading zone. "We are out of crates. The truck is full, and there are still 10 rows left." Hanako ran to the edge of the field. The old Rio flatbed truck groaned under the weight of the harvest, mounds of green and gold piled high against the wooden slat sides. "Empty them on the mess hall floor if you have to," Hanako ordered. "Send the truck back. Use blankets. Use aprons. Just get it out of the ground." The driver revved the engine, the tires flattening under the load as he lurched toward the camp warehouses. Hanako turned back to the field. It was chaos, but it was a chaos of abundance. She watched a young boy, no older than 10, struggling to carry a pumpkin that had grown in the intercropped rows. It was massive, swollen with juice, a bright orange sun against his dark coat. 30%, she calculated mentally, maybe 40. The contour lines hadn't just saved the soil, they had amplified it. They had tricked the arid high plains into thinking it was a river valley. By sunset, the temperature had dropped to 34 degrees. The last truck had departed. The field was stubble, the beautiful green ribbons shaved down to the brown earth, ready to sleep. Hanako stood by the gate, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. Her hands were raw, blistered from the rough wood of the baskets. Miller pulled up in his Ford. He didn't get out. He just leaned out the window, looking at the mountain of produce piled near the weigh station. "Mess Hall 3 says they don't have room for the squash," Miller said, a slight grin touching the corner of his mouth. "They're stacking them in the hallways." Hanako looked at him. The cold wind bit at her cheeks, but she felt a strange warmth in her chest. "We beat the frost," she said. "You beat the geography," Miller corrected. "You and your crew." He threw a clipboard onto the passenger seat. "I need the final yield numbers on my desk tomorrow, Hanako. Washington wants to know how a bunch of internees outproduced the local farmers." He drove off. Hanako looked back at the darkening field. The contour lines were invisible now in the twilight, but she knew they were there. They were the skeleton of their survival. She touched her own stomach. Tonight and all, winter, the camp would eat. Not the stale government rations, but the fruit of their own labor, grown from American soil using American science, but harvested with Japanese hands. The hunger was gone. October 5th, 1945. The office of the Agricultural Division smelled of stale coffee and pipe tobacco. The smell of the administration. It was warm, heated by a coal stove that hissed softly in the corner. Hanako stood before Dale Miller's desk. She placed a single sheet of paper on the green blotter. It was WWII Form 103, Seasonal Crop Yield Report. Miller picked up the paper. He put on his reading glasses. He ran his finger down the column of figures. He stopped at the bottom. 42 bushels per acre, he read aloud. He looked up, peering over his rims. The farmers in town averaged 25. The soil held, Hanako said. It was the same phrase she had whispered to Mrs. Sato months ago in the heat of August. But now, spoken in this office, it carried a different weight. It wasn't just about the dirt. Miller leaned back in his chair. The springs squeaked. "You know, Hanako, the war ended last month. The surrender is signed. People will be leaving this camp soon, going back to California, going back to Japan. He gestured to the wall behind him. What will you take with you? Hanako looked past him to the wall. Pinned there was the large USGS topographic map of the Arkansas Valley. Back in April, those swirling brown lines had looked like chaos to her, an insult to the rectitude of her ancestors. Now, she traced them with her eyes. She saw the logic of the curves. They didn't fight the gravity. They danced with it. They accepted the shape of the world as it was, not as they wished it to be. She had come here thinking her straight lines were strength. She had learned that strength was the ability to bend without breaking. I will take the method, Hanako said quietly. Japan has hills too, and rain. Miller nodded slowly. He uncapped his Parker 51 fountain pen and held it out to her, handle first. Sign it. It's your harvest. Hanako took the pen. The barrel was warm from his hand. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She bent over the desk and signed her name at the bottom of the American government form, Hanako Tanaka. She wrote it in English, but with the fluid, brush-like pressure of someone who knew that the most beautiful lines are rarely straight. She capped the pen and placed it back on the desk. Outside the window, the fields of Amache lay brown and dormant under the first snow, resting in the curved embrace she had carved for them. Thank you, Mr. Miller, she said. She turned and walked out of the office, stepping into the cold air not as a prisoner of war, but as a student of the earth.